Okay, first off, this might count as giving up the fact that the video is clickbait right off the bat, but I am not referring to X when I talk about this video, just the numbered Xenoblade games. The next Xenoblade project they work on after 3 better be an X Definitive Edition or sequel. I'm not trying to take that away from people. The second thing is, Xenoblade 3 media previews are out now, and I will not be talking about those or even the Xenoblade 3 Direct. The only footage and information about the game that will be in this video is stuff that was revealed prior to the Direct, so primarily the first 2 trailers and information revealed alongside them. And lastly, spoilers for Xenoblade 1 and 2. When I say that Xenoblade 3 should be the end of the series, I am admittedly making a lot of very baseless assumptions on what its story is actually going to contain. A lot of people are thinking that 3 is going to be some big conclusive thing, wrapping up all of the remaining plot threads and things from 1 and 2, as well as providing full closure to all of the characters returning from either game. And if that is the case, then this video holds. If that is not true, and they are clearly setting up more things, either in the future of Ionios, in the future of Xenoblade 1 and 2, or just something else about this specific Xeno universe, then it doesn't really hold because it's clear that Xenoblade 3 is not the end of this saga and they're going to go for a Xenoblade 4. I've used the term before, but I don't think I coined it myself, so please do not give me credit for it, but people like to refer to the current trilogy of numbered Xenoblade games as the Klaus Saga, because everything that happened in 1 and 2 and will happen in 3 is a direct result of just the one dude messing around with the conduit too much. If Xenoblade 3 is some grand conclusive tale that puts an end to all of this story of life and of loss, of sorrow and song, one final requiem for a foolish man's experiment, then they should not call the next game Xenoblade, especially if it's not going to revolve around some specific special weapon like these 3 did. While the name changes only happen for legal reasons, each iteration of Xeno is its own different thing that likes to reinvent aspects of the original Perfect Work story in different ways, so I feel like if 3 is able to end the 24-year-long curse and give us a Xeno game that tells its original intended story without any restrictions on the developer's visions, then as long as that story doesn't intentionally leave open ends, it's okay to retire the Xenoblade name and move on to Xeno something else, even if the gameplay is going to be basically another Xenoblade game, and much more similar to that than Xenoblade 1 was to Gears or Saga. You might think that, oh, they only gave the name Xenoblade to Xenoblade 1 in the first place for, quote-unquote, honoring Tetsuya Takahashi's RPG legacy, but let's be real, it was probably an advertising decision, and changing the name of the series after what might be the most popular and well-received game in it is a stupid idea, but I feel like while yes, you do have to kind of assume the lowest common denominator for consumers a lot of the time, people already commonly refer to a Xenoblade game as just Xeno and then the number or letter, so if the same developers make another game that starts with Xeno, I feel like you're not going to lose too many sales, and if someone's confused enough to ask in a public place on the internet, pretty much everyone is just going to say they have done this before and point out Gears and Saga. Going back to Xenoblade 1 being given the Xeno name partway through its development, this also slightly exacerbates the issue of getting into the Xeno series, as well as your starting point not necessarily being a good representation of the series as a whole. This is what I like to call the Trails problem, because Xenoblade does not really have this issue yet, but oh god, Trails certainly does. I have videos on this channel of how to get into both of them, and the Trails one is like 3 times as long as the Xeno one, despite it all being one continuous story and only having a couple more games. The good thing about Xeno is that while yes, it is this big, complex, convoluted series that's connected across multiple different developers and publishers and IPs, and a lot of the games are hard to get your hands on, it's actually relatively easy to get into. There are 5 good starting points to the series that I could reasonably recommend depending on your tastes. Xenogears, Xenosaga 1, and any Xenoblade game prior to 3. While yes, Nintendo loves to say that you can totally get into Xenoblade 3 and play it fully without understanding anything from the rest of the series, even some of the press releases are saying that people who've played 1 and 2 will get so much more out of it, so yeah, Xenoblade 3 is not going to be a very good starting point. 3 is very clearly a Xenoblade fan's Xenoblade game. It's tying together 2 games in the series, providing far future conclusions and things, bringing up new thematic elements and things from older Xeno games, All the while, the gameplay seems to be answering as many complaints that people had for Xenoblade 1 and 2 as possible. But that is perfectly okay, because there are 2 other Xenoblade games on the Switch, and while 1 is better for the job than 2 is, both are good starting points for the series, so they can get away with making a game that's a bad starting point without any issue. Compare that to the Trails series. I am currently playing through Kuro no Kiseki, which is the 11th game in the ongoing story, using a fan translation because it won't be out in English for a very long time. Kuro is the 4th Trails game that released primarily for PS4, and none of those 4 games are good starting points. The 3 games before Kuro were Trails of Cold Steel 3 and 4, aka Nihon Falcom's versions of Infinity War and Endgame, and Trails into Reverie, aka Falcom's version of Marineford, aka an even bigger crossover that provides a conclusion to the entire first half of the series while foreshadowing things from the half to come. Out of all of these games, Kuro is by far the best place a new person can start the series, because it's the only one that is not a direct sequel to a previous game. It is starting a brand new story arc, the 4th one in Trails history. However, it is a very Xenoblade 3-esque game. It is a Trails fans' Trails game, both in terms of things that have been referenced from the past and will leave a new player completely confused already just in the first chapter out of 6, but also in terms of fixing gameplay problems people had in the 5 games that use the Cold Steel formula. Kuro is, by all accounts, a top-tier Trails game, but that is irrelevant if it's not a good place for new people to get into the series. It sold worse than the last game in the Cold Steel arc, and that's kind of concerning for the future of the series, considering the fact that sales tend to go down at every new installment in something. Not every series is a Xenoblade 2 success story. So, despite Trails making 2 of the best games it has back-to-back with Reverie and Kuro, it's not looking great for people getting into the series. The only people playing those new great games are the ones who are already invested in Trails, because the last decent starting point they made was Trails of Cold Steel 1 back in 2013, and the last game that I can recommend as a starting point without any drawbacks, aka the equivalent of starting with either Xenogears, Xenosaga, or Xenoblade 1, was the original Trails game, Trails in the Sky First Chapter, from 2004. This is not the direction I want to see Xeno go in. Trilogies are a common enough thing in media where I feel like you could get away with telling someone they have to play all of Xenoblade 1, 2, and 3 despite their lengths. You can start them by saying, yeah, just play all of these. It does help that the best place to start is Xenoblade 1, and you can pull the whole "this is one of the best reviewed and highest regarded JRPGs of all time" card on that, but I feel like even that much isn't going to be enough to get an average person, possibly someone who hasn't played a non-Pokemon JRPG before, to get into the entire series if they reveal Xenoblade 4 in 2024, and it turns out you have to play 1, 2, and 3 just to be caught up for it. I feel like it would be a much better sell if they reveal Xenoblade X stuff in 2024 and 2025, of course, and then in 2027, for whatever Nintendo's next system is, they reveal Xeno Skies, a new JRPG from Monolith Soft, creators of the Xenoblade series. If you have a friend who's maybe never played a JRPG before, sees the game, hey, that looks cool, then what you can be like is, this game was made by the same people who made the Xenoblade series. The main storyline of that series ended in Xenoblade 3, which is why they're moving on to a slightly different title for this specific game. This is the start of a whole new storyline for Xeno, so you can go into this one without worrying about missing a whole lot from the previous games. There will be references and callbacks because that's just how these developers work, but because this is the first game in a new series, it's not going to be anything major that could directly affect your enjoyment of the story as a whole. If you're interested in this kind of game, and want to try something similar out beforehand, then here we go, you can play Xenoblade Definitive Edition and experience one of the highest regarded JRPGs of all time to see if you'd be interested in something else these developers made. If you like it, but don't want to get invested in 2 more massive JRPGs, there is no commitment here, and if you don't like it, then hey, you know ahead of time whether or not you're going to want to play Xeno Skies at launch. We've already had thousands of people who are massive Xenoblade fans, so the people who are most invested in the series rushing to get through Xenogears and Xenosaga before 3 comes out because of the huge amount of references and callbacks we've seen just in a couple minutes worth of trailer stuff. And while the buzz around 3 has been overwhelmingly positive, I still think it's alienating people who watched the trailers casually, saw things they liked, and did a little bit of research before buying the game themselves, only to learn that plenty of big fans of the series are now playing 7 other games to be prepared for it. Imagine that happens again with Xenoblade 4, but it's 8 other games, and Xenoblade 3 is one of the longer ones in the series. There's a point where it just becomes unsustainable, and you need to do another reboot like they did with Xenoblade 1. While I'm primarily focusing on story here, gameplay is also something that inevitably is going to need to be rebooted at some point, and I'm pretty sure the only way they could do that without really annoying a lot of people is with a soft or hard reboot of Xenoblade as a whole. Definitive Edition is the best place to get into the series because it has the simplest gameplay and teaches it to you properly. It doesn't actually matter if 3 fixes the issues people had with X's and 2's tutorials, because just based on what we've seen, its battle system is so much more complex than Xenoblade 1's, that there are only a few edge cases, that is, someone who's already a big JRPG fan or MMO player and doesn't care about story whatsoever, where I could reasonably recommend starting with 3 from a gameplay perspective. They added an in-battle character switch button in 3, which is something people have been asking for since 2010 when the first game came out, and that in and of itself is enough depth where it could probably carry a battle system even for more experienced players who want complexity and stuff. So if they say, we are starting a new story arc, or we are starting a new Xeno series, and the battle system they give is Xenoblade 1 level of depth, speed, and complexity, but with the character switch button, then that's not really a bad thing. Yeah, maybe they're going backwards in complexity, but they're keeping the most interesting thing Xenoblade 3 added, and presumably, starting a new story arc or new Xeno series also gives them the opportunity to experiment more and make more drastic changes than they might have been willing to do with the battle systems of X, 2, or 3. And then lastly, this is probably by far the least important part, and only matters to a small subsection of fans who are obsessive over the entire Xeno series like I am, and that is that with every new Xenoblade game that comes out, Xenoblade 1 plot-wise becomes a worse starting point for the series, and that's, again, tying back to the fact that it wasn't initially a Xeno game and was given the title partway through development. The thought process behind the creation of Xenoblade 1 wasn't, we're going to create another game like Xenogears and Xenosaga, it was, let's make the best JRPG we can. And it resulted in a great game, but now it's a Xeno game and lacks a lot of the defining elements of Xeno as a series. Elements that have only been progressively more and more blatantly added in with X, then 2, and now 3. The ending of Xenoblade 2 just straight up happens in Xenosaga, by the way, and both 2 and 3 are retellings of different aspects of Xenogears, not to mention the general existence of the conduit, and Xenoblade 1 being the first Xeno game to not include a MacGuffin like that, so it gets a bit weird. On one hand, Xenoblade 1 is a great starting point because it's its own self-contained story that does not focus on the meta aspects of Xeno. On the other hand, it does not focus on the meta aspects of Xeno, so it's not a typical Xeno story, and if you don't play it first and are into all of those meta aspects and the whole meta story that's going on in the entire series, you might be kind of bored for 80 hours because it doesn't focus on any of that or advance any of that in any meaningful way, so it will just be spinning its wheels for the entire time, and you better hope you get invested in the plot or characters that are specific to one or just the gameplay. Basically, Xenoblade 1 is the perfect starting point for the Xeno series, but only when what is actively being made by the developers is continuations of the same Klaus saga that was spawned by Xenoblade 1. Once the whole saga is over, we're going to need a new starting point to the series, on a plot level, on a gameplay level, and on a meta level. And since it seems Monolith has been given all of the time and resources they could possibly need to make Xenoblade 3, and basically all the news we've had about it is ridiculously good, so it will probably sell and review well, we have no reason to believe that they won't get similar resources and time to make the next game, which means they can go into it intentionally making a starting point for the series that is an even better one than Xenoblade 1 has been for the past 12 years. You may disagree with me, but I still think the best way to do that is to end the Xenoblade story at its natural conclusion and then move on to Xeno something else, whatever comes next. By the end of this year, Xenoblade will have been around for longer than Gears and Saga combined, so I think the end of Xenoblade 3's hype cycle is a fairly reasonable time to say, yes, this is the end of this chapter of the story, we're moving on to something else now. They can, and definitely should, continue using the Xenoblade name for future X games. Keep that train going for as long as Nintendo is willing to give you money, and as long as X fans are still clamoring for more, because it's been, 7 years, and X fans have had to wait for 2 Definitive Edition and 3 now. Yeah, I think you owe them not just an X Definitive Edition, but also, 2 new X games. So, yeah, just make Xenoblade the name for the open world stuff, and then Xeno New Thing the name for the more linear stuff that plays more like Xenoblade 1, 2, and 3. That might be very confusing, but I feel like after a couple games come out, then even a casual Nintendo fan will just have a 2-sentence description of, this is why Xenoblade is like this now, and this is why there's another Xeno thing. And lastly, Xenoblade 3 is the first time the developers have been able to make a new Xeno game from the ground up with what seems to be an uncompromised and fully realized vision. The 2 times in the past they've had to move on and make a new Xeno series were because they failed to do that and were unable to continue making games with their old IP. So we're getting to see them make a Xeno game on their own terms for the first time ever, and that's going to be great. I love that fact. And yet, it's only game 3 of a trilogy. Don't you want to see them make an entire Xeno series on their own terms for the first time? Because I sure would. Just food for thought. Until next time, this is Luxon, signing off.